Learning Objective 1 in depth. The first planning domain, also known as the first step in the planning process, is to establish and define the advisor relationship. So if you're going to work with a client, if you're going to work with a consumer, some very important questions need to be asked up front. What exactly will you be doing together? What financial planning services are you initially going to engage in? You can always add more on, we can always detract, but what is this initial agreement in the relationship that we have? We want to clarify the responsibilities, responsibility of the advisor, responsibility of the consumer. We also need to be clear on our background, our philosophy, and our method of compensation. And let's make sure that it's in line with the values and orientation of the consumer. We're going to explain the process before we get started. We're going to say this is stage 1. It's an 8-stage process, and these are the steps we go through. We want to set our expectations that the consumer knows exactly what's coming, and we can share what's coming as well. In this first step of the process, it's important to also set some limits. Generally speaking, financial planners don't perform personal income tax. Generally speaking, we don't review wills, we don't set up trusts, we don't read codicils. And so we need to set some limitations. I'm going to help you with your personal financial goals, but perhaps not legal services, perhaps not accounting services. If I'm not property casualty licensed, I can always build a team and bring in professionals, but we need to state up front what we can and cannot do for the client. The second planning domain is to gather data. Important, that's necessary to complete the planning engagement. The planning engagement was set in the first domain. What am I helping the client with? Now let's move to the second domain. What data do I need to gather? Generally speaking, we want a fact finder filled out. We want different tax return documents brought in, pay stubs. There's an entire list in the text. I would encourage you to take a look. It's quite comprehensive. But based on what type of planning I'm doing, I'm going to gather different and appropriate data. Also in domain 2, we really want the client to hit home on their goals. Well, we initially engaged the client, and now let's really narrow down on those goals. What are your financial goals? What can I help the consumer work through? Is it buying a home? Is it developing a retirement income distribution plan? Is it both? Is it perhaps refinancing a current note and in doing that, aiding in the income flow? Am I looking at long-term care? Am I looking at disability? There's a wealth of potential goals the client has. Some of those goals are in the forefront of their mind. Some of those goals we work through in a risk assessment process. Lastly, we're going to help them develop and prioritize the goals. A client may have 10 different goals. I sure know I do. I'd love to retire at 50. I'd love to move to Maui. I would love to live in the biggest house on the block, but unfortunately, those aren't reality. So I'm going to have to prioritize my goals. What's most important to me? What's next important? What type of goals are in the number 1 must-do class, and what type of goals I'd like to get to, but I realize they can wait. So the second domain, gather information, including goals, and help clients prioritize those goals. The third domain, analyze and evaluate financial status. We want to use the right tool to get the job done. If we're trying to hang a picture, we're going to put a nail in the wall. If we're trying to hang a door, we're going to put screws in the wall. Okay? The type of tool we use, a screwdriver or hammer, is going to dictate if we get the door put in place or if we put the picture up. We're not going to use a screwdriver to necessarily hammer a nail in the wall. That's not very efficient. And the same analogy goes towards financial planning. If we're asked to calculate a complicated retirement income solution, retirement income formula, we're going to use sophisticated software, cash flow-based software, Monte Carlo analysis. We're going to do everything we can to help that client understand the probability of success, the likelihood that they're going to get to their goal, the growth of their assets, the risks facing them. But for a goal as I need to understand car refinancing, we might just have a financial calculator and use the calculator as a tool. Some goals may be appropriate at the back of a napkin, some outside-the-box thinking. Let's list out some pros and cons. Let's make a SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunity, threats. Some goals require abstract thinking. Some goals require complex cash flow-based financial planning tools. In the third domain, we analyze the goals of the client. We take a look at the resources available. We take a look at the outcomes. We're going to measure them against risks. And in this third domain of the financial planning process, we're going to say, hey, to the client, can we or can we not meet our goals? In this step, we start to develop the end recommendations we're going to give the consumer, which brings us to the fourth domain. The fourth domain is to develop recommendations and alternatives. I can't stress alternatives quite enough. It's not just that we're going to give one answer for the goal, as so many financial goals have multiple answer sets. When we talk about retirement, a consumer may say, I want to retire at 65, and I want to live like I currently do. My parents are still alive and healthy, and they're in their 80s. Well, we can begin to develop recommendations. And if our retiree can meet their needs, fantastic. But if they can't, perhaps we give alternatives to the client. We say, well, we could retire at 65, but it won't quite be like it is today. Or we perhaps can retire at 64, but we're going to live on a lot less. If we wait till 66, we can retire a little happier and a little healthier. Are we going to live in our current home? What if we move into assisted living, or perhaps bring in some sort of at-home help from time to time? All of these are alternative solutions to the client, and we always need to be cognizant that one recommendation that's going to inevitably be somewhat framed by our biases is not always appropriate to give that consumer. So we're going to have more than one. We're going to present recommendations and alternatives. And if we're not an expert, let's bring them in. I'm not an expert in buy-sell disability. I would happily know where to find one, bring them in to help with that recommendation. The client is involved in the fourth domain. They help guide us between alternatives. Well, I like this one, I don't like that one. I like this one, I don't like that one. The client is a key part of the fourth domain. The fifth domain is when we communicate to the client. I'm going to communicate to that individual. And it's my job as a financial planner, and in Chapter 2 of the text we cover this in much more depth, to communicate appropriately, to use the right written messages, perhaps the right pictures, charts and graphs, some color. I want to make sure that this message is understood. The pros, the cons, the consequences, the outcomes, any limitations of my recommendation need to be communicated to the consumer so they understand what we're about to do. And I need them to communicate back to me that they understand the recommendations. Communication is the key between a document being delivered and a plan being implemented. Implementation follows communication. We really need to go back to expectations with implementation. What is it that the client's going to do? What is it that the advisor's going to do? And while I should be disclosing conflicts of interest throughout the process, it's particularly relevant before we implement. If there's any conflicts that haven't been aired, now's the last time we really have to air them before a product sale is made. With implementation, there may be areas where I'm not licensed, where I'm not competent. I'm going to bring in that professional who is to implement the recommendation. Always think a team approach. You may be the coach of the team, but in implementation, we need to make sure everything gets done. And I've got to make sure a will gets in place. I'm not an attorney, but if I'm working with a young family who doesn't have a will, doesn't have guardianship papers, I'm going to ensure that that gets done before we move into the monitoring phase. The seventh financial planning domain is to monitor. Think of a house for a moment. You have changes that happen inside the house. You have changes that happen outside the house. And when we monitor a plan, the internal changes we're only going to know about if we reach out to the client. Do they have a child? Was there a disability and unemployment in the family? We're only going to know about these changes if we reach out to the client on a periodic basis. External changes that will impact the plan, macroeconomic shocks, the stock market going up 20%, the stock market going down 20%. These are external risk factors on the house. When we talk about domain 7, we monitor. The plan we give is only good for the instant it is given. After that, the values have changed, the numbers have changed. We constantly need to reevaluate the process of planning to ensure that our recommendations stay valid, helpful to the client. Lastly, we talk a little bit about Domain 8, professional standards. Think of it as a circle around all the other domains. Based on your business model, you're going to have different rules to follow, and you must follow all of them, and at the same time, maintain high ethical standard of care. And if you're a CHFC or CLU or CFP, you're agreeing to that standard of care implicit in the planning relationship. If you're an insurance agent in life and health, well, the state that you're licensed in and any other states you do business in are an issue. The company that appoints you is going to require ethical behavior as well. Same goes for brokers, only now you have a national party, the SEC and FINRA, as well as state legislation and securities sales. And if you're an insurance agent and a broker and an investment advisor, we have an additional rules, procedures to follow from an SEC standpoint. So the more you do in financial planning, the more regulatory web you need to be aware of, capable, and competent in.